So I love how Spirit works, because when I was reading the inspiration for this week's talk, I was not inspired. So I took it and I just set it aside and said, there's really nothing in this that I can reconfigure into something that will make sense. So it meant that I had to kind of move off in my own direction. And a lot of times, like Mykal was saying, with Memorial Day, I thought, well, it's a great time to be honoring those that we want to memorialize, those that have come before us, and those who have helped us be who we are now. And then David sent a couple of songs, and there's the other song too. He was a little surprised that I wanted that one, but that one was exactly the tone that I wanted us to move from. And then we saw the movie, Five People You Meet in Heaven, and it kind of locked everything in place. So what I want to do is I want to walk along the storyline of Five People You Meet in Heaven and use reflections from that along with some of the lessons that are inspired with Science of Mind, but are updated with some psychological discoveries that have happened since the time that Ernest Holmes spoke. Because sometimes what can happen is religious science there are some traditions where religious science gets trapped in the older contexts that Ernest Holmes spoke from. There's been so much in the way of understanding about how the brain works, understanding about how a scientific understanding. And Ernest Holmes was Science of Mind. So it wasn't only Science of Mind ended when Ernest Holmes' teachings began and ended. Science of Mind is this ongoing movement forward. And so how do we build from that rather than stick to something that's just old, tried and true? How do we find the things that are new, tried and true? So what I want us to consider is Memorial Day ultimately leads back into the notion of memories. When Mykal was flashing those pictures, pictures are a great trigger of memories. So what I'd like us all to do for just a moment, just close our eyes and pay attention. What memories come forward about someone or something that we love that is not present to us now, that has stopped being present? And when we land on that, to just be aware, does it come to us as an image? Does it come to us as a sound? Does it come to us as a little headline, as like a verbal news headline? Does it come to us as a feeling in our gut? Does it come to us as a smell that's wafting through the air? Does it come to us as a sensation, as a feeling of peace or excitement? And when we've connected with that sensory trigger of that memory, just open our eyes and come back to the room. One of the things that I want us to notice is we've heard the expression of thought plus a feeling leads to a belief. So often, memories are planted in a feeling context. It's almost impossible to convey a memory if we don't have the feeling with the memory. How many times has someone asked us, tell me what you remember? And under that kind of pressured calling, we may find that we are not as clear about that memory as we can be in other circumstances. Another thing about memory is we tend to think about memory as something as simple as like a recording. That we have just stored all of these videotapes in the back of our mind, and that we just have to be able to go into the library of all of our videotapes and pull it out, and there it is. But the fact is that memory doesn't work like that. One of the things that they've demonstrated over time is that memory is a very fluid animal. And in terms of even criminal prosecutions, eyewitnesses are not the best source of information. Personal recounts are not the best source of information, because what happens is that it gets laden with all kinds of interferences. And that's one of the things that we got to see in the movie. And I say we had Reba and we had Stephanie and Mykal and myself, but the rest of you kind of get to hear about it because you weren't here. So the story was about this man named Eddie. And Eddie worked as a maintenance person in this amusement park, Ruby Pier. And the children would see Eddie because his little name tag on his uniform said Eddie Maintenance, and they would always call him Eddie Maintenance. And he's like, maintenance is not my last name, it's just what I do. And in the story, the 5 people you meet in heaven, what happens is, through the course of the story, Eddie's memories are reconstructed. Rather than just being left with the static memories that he held, over the course of the film, Eddie's memories are reconstructed by 5 people who enable him to see his life in a totally different way. And it's really that process. How do we open ourselves to seeing our lives in a totally different way that enables us to embrace our lives, that enables us to give ourselves, and in turn to give others compassion? You've all seen my story about they were able to catch monkeys by putting a banana in the cage. And when the monkey puts their hand in the cage and holds their hand with the banana in it, they can't get their hand back out of the cage. So they're trapped by this banana monkey box cage. And the monkey just will not let go of the banana, so they can't get out of the box. It would be very easy if the monkey just let go of the banana. They could get their hand out of the box and they could get away. The problem is that many of us have memories that are very much like that banana in the box. How many times are we holding onto that banana, and do we refuse to let it go because, by God, we worked to get that banana and we are not going to let go of that banana? But we do not necessarily recognize that we have caught ourselves in this trap. I'm seeing nodding, so I guess I'm not the only monkey with my hand on the banana. In the course of the 5 people that you meet in heaven, Eddie is confronted with both beloved, intimate people who knew him so, so well. And Eddie encounters people that are seemingly complete strangers. Now we may pause for a moment and we may think, well, of course somebody that knows me well is able to illuminate how I've misremembered my life. How many times have we lived in a moment and we're sharing that moment with somebody else and they'll contradict us? Am I the only one that's had that? Okay, I'm the only one that's had that. So, I've told a memory. A good illustration of this can be kind of a thoughtlessness about my retelling of a memory. I had a memory about how my father and mother were together as a couple. And I was all too eager to tell my sister about how she and her fiance were very much like my mother and father. Now, this was unsolicited communication. It's not like my sister said, hey, tell me about our memories of mom and dad, and tell me about how you're seeing me and this other person, I won't name because I don't want to put that person out into the universe. But needless to say, my sister was none too pleased with me and my hugely insightful psychological profiling of what it was that I was observing. How often do we put our memories like on an altar to be worshipped? How often do we put our own analysis, our own understandings, and just present it as wisdom that will better facilitate how the universe moves forward? I own that. I don't know if any of you ever do that. The problem is that, like in that story, that was the vehicle through which Eddie Maintenance established a certain mediocrity about his life. He had just come to conclude that he hadn't reached the goals that he had set for himself. He hadn't gotten there, and that was essentially his claim to fame. That was what he saw as an intrinsic piece about himself. How often do we claim a certain story? Do we identify with life operating in a certain way, and do we make that our own identity? Eddie hadn't thought he had done much with his life. I mean, I think perhaps, I know for myself, there are times that I feel that I could have done better. I feel that what I've done with my life isn't as much as what I envisioned doing with my life. And again, I don't speak to any of you in terms of how you assess and judge your life. But for me, I found that a very compelling reason to identify with Eddie. That I haven't always lived up to my highest hopes for myself at any given moment. And I can use that as a way to beat myself up. I can also use that as an excuse. Circumstances were such, and this is just where I've ended up. I mean, there was a time where I literally described my life, described my career choices, comparing it to a train wreck. I saw the choices that I made, that there was a wreck that happened in my life, and now I was just living out of the back of the train wreck. Eddie received the opportunities to reconfigure his memories from other people's perspectives. As mentioned, some of them were strangers that he didn't even know. Some of them were a stranger that he remembered vaguely. So I'd like us to take a moment and just close our eyes again, and I'd like us to consider some person that we may know very vaguely who has helped us see our lives in a new way. So just be with that new insight. Be with what that discovery brought. One of the things about the Science of Mind teachings is that heaven isn't a place to get to. Heaven is a place where we already are. Heaven is not a destination to go towards. Heaven is the essence of our lives. Now, we may often feel that that is a crazy notion, to say that heaven is right where I am now. But that was one of the things that Ernest Holmes promoted as a consideration, that we are in heaven or hell according to our own choices. Now, I know I've wrestled with that. I wrestle with that because as a person of such great privilege, I mean, there are things that are available to me because of how I was born into the world that aren't available to others. But rather than using that as an argument to say, well, that's just all BS, that heaven and hell are choices that we choose moment by moment, even people who have been through terrible suffering have known that there are choices in the midst of the suffering. The author of Night by Elie Wiesel, he was on his way to a Holocaust camp. And he described the moment of heaven, seeing the pink of the sunrise coming into the train car where he was. He was able to grasp that heaven was available to him, even in miserable, terrible circumstances. In the movie, Eddie Maintenance was given opportunities to see where heaven had been accessible to him without his conscious knowing. But it was that sharing of the memories. It was getting that other perspective that gave him access to living in heaven rather than living in hell. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, there's a very clear embodiment of this. There's a whole person with whom the person literally shares, this doesn't seem like heaven. How can this be your heaven? If I'm getting here and this is your heaven, how is it that this is your heaven? But by going to that heaven, there were things that Eddie learned. Sometimes the memories that we need to return to broaden our experiences. How many times might we block ourselves off from unpleasant memories? How much energy might we spend? The fancy word for that is repression. Repressing it back. Or normalizing. It was all okay. It was all good. We've talked about that some in the Science of Mind. It's all good. This was all for my good. So it was good. It was a good thing. I don't think there's any point in arguing the Holocaust is a good thing. Yeah. I'm not going there. I don't think there's any point in saying the actions of the Ku Klux Klan are a good thing. The environment that we live in where hate is promulgated on a daily basis in of itself is a good thing. But what can happen is, how do we respond to that? Do we throw more fuel onto that fire of hatred? Or do we stand for peace? Do we stand for justice? Do we stand for the betterment of more people? Do we name it? Do we call it out? What is it that we are capable of doing and being and saying? And there's not one right way to do it. again, I don't know about you, but I can get pretty judgmental when I see a certain thing happening. I was in a meeting, and what I heard being described for managing this child's behavior was, when any of these behaviors happen, what we're going to do is we're going to text you, the parent, and we're going to give them a bus token, and we're just going to send them home. Gasp. And I had that same gasp. And at the time, I knew at the time that if I say something, I am going to create a train wreck. But I knew enough that this was very, very, very wrong. That this way of dealing with a behavior was not an appropriate way. So I communicated it, and I got an idea, and then the next day I could go back and I could say, there's a process I learned. There's calling out, which is in the middle of a meeting saying, I am against this injustice, and you realize what you've said. Sometimes calling out is the best thing that we can do. There's another process called calling in, which may take a little more time, and you lean into the relationship and say, and this is what I did with this person. I leaned into the office and I said, I was thinking a lot about that communication, and I just wanted to say, I wanted you to be aware that actually that's illegal.
Yep.
And I really don't want you, and I don't want my school, and I don't want us to be perpetrating illegal things. There's no good that can come out of that. And it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that it was illegal. And again, I just have to, I had to have hold it in the back of my head and say, okay, this thing about excluding a child from their instruction, and you're not going to make any note of it, and it's not going to be noticed, and it's just that we've given you a bus pass. Bye-bye. So that wasn't going to manage what was going on. How we respond. Each of us has to be with what it is that we're called to do, and how it is that we're called to be with something. If I had raised it at the time, it would have created a whole bunch of fighting in that meeting, which didn't need to happen and which definitely wouldn't have forwarded things for the student. But by waiting a day, I could capture the attention of the person, and we could come up with a different plan much more quickly. So we have to be present to what it is that we can do. And each one of us has a different can at any given time. And how do we hold ourselves with a gentleness and a kindness about that can? So, memory is this fluid event. Memory is not a permanent fixture. It's not that videotape in the back of our minds. It's an ongoing, ever-changing process. There's two kinds of memory. You all know there's short-term and long-term memory. Thank you. And it takes time before something goes from short-term to long-term. I know that you know this, that sometimes, there are things that just, the short-term memory, you're looking at that one, that dad that you love, and you're like, I know that that's not completely operational right now. But there are elements of the long-term memory that just are solid and completely whole. And as we age, our short-term and long-term memories change. There are cues. What they found in long-term memory care for people is that they build all kinds of cues. It may be that there's a kind of music that's played. It may be that there are kinds of pictures and images that are placed around. It may be there are all kinds of ways to tap in to that still available resource of long-term memory. And actually, there are things that we can do to enhance our short-term memory. I'm not a commercial, but talk to me later. There are particular things that we can do about building and sustaining our short-term memories that then feed our long-term memories. One of the things about the brain is that it's continually able to adapt. What we know is that when little brains are first born, there is just this pile of possibilities. But when that little brain is first born, it can't do much of anything. There are these things that get developed over time called neural pathways. And there are ways that we can reinforce neural pathways. Now, the second part of the story that I want to address is the notion of those people close to us who build memories with us. We all have those people with whom we have shared great intimacy. We all have those people that have been beloved and life-altering. I think one of the things about Memorial Day is it's a celebration of, oftentimes for us personally, for those people. So I'd just like us to take a moment and consider who is it that we want to reverence as one of those people who have lifted us and lit us and inspired us, that had a closeness to our lives. And I invite us all just to take a deep breath in together. And with that breath in, just hold it for a moment. And then breathe it out. And breathe it out with a gratitude. And again, breathe in again. So much has been given. And then breathe out the thank you. One more time. Just breathe in so much that has been given to us. Breathe out a gratitude. We have been loved and held and nurtured and cared for. Sometimes that love and nurturing and caring hasn't come in ways that we might have preferred.
Amen.
Stephanie talked about the challenge that Eddie Maintenance faced when he was given the invitation to forgive his father. The way that he could forgive his father was that he was able to see him from a different vantage point. He was able to see him through the memory of another person. He was able to see the whole picture rather than just the limited image that he has. Some of you heard this, some of you haven't been here to hear this, but how many remember there's a story of blind men and an elephant? And the blind men all wander up to the elephant, and then they start to describe what the elephant is. Oh, it's this snake. Snake, it's nothing like a snake, it's a wall. No, it's a tree trunk. No, it's a rope. No, it's this spear. Each blind man has grabbed, they've grabbed the tusk of the elephant, they've grabbed the tail of the elephant, they've grabbed the leg of the elephant, they've grabbed the side of the elephant. The trunk of the elephant. There are all of these different ways of seeing and being with the elephant. How can we let go of the fixation of our own particular take on the elephant? how do we be more receptive to the notion that that other person has a different experience than we do? You can kind of see that there's a potential spiritual practice being associated with this. How do we open ourselves to other perspectives? Because we're never going to be able to change that memory if we can't open to that. One of the things that Eddie referred to in the film, and I'm not telling you details that will spoil the film for anybody who wants to go and see it, is that when he first arrived, there was just a sense of lightness. There was a sense of weightlessness. There was a sense of capacity that he hadn't experienced for such a long time. And one of the people lets him know why that feeling goes away. When we burden ourselves with hate, when we burden ourselves with anger, when we burden ourselves with pain, when we burden ourselves with a particular kind of memory, we change how we can be in the world. How do we pay attention to what it is that we're holding on to in terms of our memory? How do we pay attention to our rigorous hold on certain things? I'm not going to tell you who the last person was that Eddie meets, because that would completely spoil the movie for you.
Mm-hmm.
But the last person that he meets is someone that is a complete surprise. Who in our lives surprises us? What in our lives would leave us mystified and awed and, I can't believe it, astounded? How do we open ourselves to a space where we can be awed by our lives? Memorial Day, this day of memories, it can be a day of gravity, where we are aware of grief, that there are people that are gone. I was part of a group, Compassionate Heart Ministry, and we would hold opportunities where people could share about spaces and being in a grief process. What I'd like to argue is that we're all in a lifelong grief process, because life is ever changing. There's this cycle of grief, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the first person who kind of articulated it. There's this passage. Something happens, and ostensibly the first phase is denial. This can't really be happening. And then there's bargaining. Well, what if this were to happen? What if I were to do this instead of this? And then there's anger. And then there is, after the anger, there is starting to let go. And one of the things about this grief process, and then we're kind of ready to start again. One of the things about this grief process is it does not necessarily follow a linear sequence. So it can be very disturbing to find that I was in the bargaining stage, and now I'm back in the denial stage. What is wrong with me? So an image that got created is the idea that there's really this fear of grief, and that our experiences bounce around in unpredictable manners within it. So we may land in a phase of fury, or sadness, or reconstruction, in ways that are not sequential. And we may land in mixtures of it, in different fields of these. To recognize that grief has been called a final way of giving love. A final act through which we can be conveying love to a person. Grief is how we individually manage loss. But none of us ever lose alone. We all have experiences. I mean, there's no one person who's had loss and no one else has not had loss. Being alive is about gaining and losing. And like the monkey in the cage, I can't let go of my gain unless I let go. How often do we stay trapped in those boxes? So, in summary, for those 5 people who we meet in heaven, just pay attention when we have gotten ourselves trapped. Eddie was trapped and his life wasn't good enough. He didn't live up to what he thought he could be. Just pay attention. Are we finding that about ourselves? Are we saying that about ourselves? Have I not done what I'm supposed to do? Have I not been enough, done enough, said enough? Enough, 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 enough. How much am I critiquing my enoughness? My adequacy? How much am I critiquing the adequacy of another person? Because it's really easy to look on another person and recognize their inadequacy. Or maybe I should say, it's really easy for me to recognize the inadequacy of another person. You all might have completely passed a level, and I may be in the presence of the bodhisattvas here who can't see that happening anymore around them. You've all let go. So you're my confessors. I am confessing to you that sometimes I still pass judgments on people as in not enoughness. How often do we remind ourselves? How often do we let ourselves be in our memories? And do we allow those memories to transform? If a memory is miserable, are we like the monkey in the box holding on to that memory? Or are we willing to allow a different perspective? I'm arguing about all this because Ernest Holmes promoted the idea that heaven is not an eventual arrival location. Heaven is right here, right now, if we become, to the extent that we become conscious of it. So, what's our box? And what's our accessibility to heaven now? If there's someone in our lives who loves us or who has loved us, and if we were to imagine what they saw and let that change our memory, what would it do to us to open to their possible memory? How would our lives change if we open to that alternative memory? How receptive are we to the possibility of some stranger that we may not even know? Someone who may be generations back or generations forward. that can change us. I talked about it again earlier, the notion in another talk. I talked about time travel. That we can envision a different experience for someone. Others may be able to envision a different experience for us. How open are we to a different experience? That it's not only those who love us and know us so well. It can be an absolute stranger. It can be a stranger twice removed. So, go forward. Be aware of our memories. And allow ourselves to be one of the people that people meet in heaven. And so it is.